with the ESL Pro League expanding from 12 teams last season to 14 teams in each division, the North American and European divisions, there's been a lot of discussion over the situation with using wildcard to add in an extra team because the other team was the team promoted. That became the 13th team. So the 14th team was from this wildcard match, which was the result of an online vote to decide which two teams got the wildcard spot. Then we've had the situation, I'll link up there, with FNATIC and GODSENT swapping some players, and so now actually the majority of the FNATIC starters now play for GODSENT. So does FNATIC keep the spot? And as a result, we're in a messy situation where it's hard for people to define what are the rules that ESL is using, what's the philosophy they're going by. And I've actually read through all the information. I've even been in contact with someone at ESL. So this is the lay of the land right now. FNATIC just lost 3 of their starters: Crims, JW, and Flusher. GODSENT gained those 3 starters, but GODSENT had to play GODSENT had to play for the EPL slot against Virtus Pro, the wildcard spot. They'd been voted in anyway. And FNATIC received 2 GODSENT players themselves, Twist and Glecro, and then brought in Wenton, who'd been their stand-in for the last EPL finals, but was definitely a stand-in, not an ultimate starter. It was a starter for the finals. And they get to retain the EPL slot, which was FNATIC's already. Team X, formerly SK Gaming, the Danish lineup, has a slot in EPL, despite the fact they've only retained 2 of the players that were in the SK lineup that played in the last season, which is Fries and Modi. And Luminosity has lost their entire lineup, the Brazilian team, to SK, who now takes that slot in EPL North America. And Luminosity, the org, is playing for a slot in EPL with an entirely new roster, a Brazilian roster as well. I think they were formerly Win Out, and they're playing the wildcard match to see if they'll get in. So this is making it confusing for people, because it seems like with these 4 different instances, so we've got FNATIC, GODSENT, Team X, Luminosity. It seems like we cover the whole gamut of what's possible, all the permutations, and yet it feels to some people on the outside that the rules are being misapplied here, or applied one way and then unfairly in another way. So what's confusing people and making them wonder how all of the above, the lay of the land, is possible, is because if the players own the slot, why does GODSENT not get FNATIC slots, as they got 3 of the 5 GODSENT FNATIC starters? If the org owns the slot, like FNATIC, then why does Luminosity not get to keep their slot? Why does SK get that slot? Why does Team X get to take the slot as the players? So people are confused as to how all these things can happen at once and be logically consistent. So ESL, Ulrich Schulze, the Flying DJ on Twitter, tried to clarify the ESL position by publishing a tweet longer, which I'll link in the description box below. And it was called "On Slot Ownership in ESL Pro League." And I'll read it out. There have been some questions around spot ownership in ESL Pro League yesterday. Here is a brief summary of what the rules are. 1. In general, the license belongs to the organization. So he's setting it out right at the outset. It's the license, the slot belongs to the org, except in circumstances. So point 2. If the minority of the lineup is changing, so only 1 or 2 players are changing, nothing happens to the slot. So Number 3, if the majority of the lineup is changing, per our license rules, the slot gets reviewed to make sure that the new lineup is of similar strength and does not consist of 5 family members of the slot owner or other potential misuse. So the key thing about point 3 is that he isn't saying that if the majority lineup changes, that it's 3 out of 5 rule like the majors and it goes to the new people. He's not saying that the org just owns the slot and they can do whatever they want with it. What he's saying is when the majority, so at least 3 players, leaves a team that has a slot and the org, then what happens is the new team must be submitted, goes under review by ESL to check that this isn't just like placeholder people to keep a hold of the slot, and that these are players of like similar strength, and that it's a legitimate team to prevent org abuse where they just kick the team, but also to prevent a scenario where the players just leave and the org's left with nothing if they could field a team that was as good. So ultimately, the key detail to remember here is the slot belongs to the org in most cases. So now, with some of the teams that we're talking about, he gives examples of how this would be applied. So for the team that is now in SK, formerly Luminosity Gaming, he says, XLG/SK. The entire lineup left LG. The slot was reviewed and transferred to SK with the players. Now, looking at it, that's entirely reasonable according to their rules that they've set out, because even though the org owns the slot, they couldn't put 5 players in there that were of similar strength. They couldn't put 5 players in there that were actually definitively good enough to be in EPL North America this season. The team win out that's come in is still very much unproven, haven't even proven themselves online, have to prove themselves offline still very much. So they're in a situation there where it makes sense to actually transfer the slot to the players and give the players the slot overall. In that scenario, the logic that they've laid out makes sense. Now we'll go to the XSK/Team X. The majority of the lineup left, but stayed together. So the slot was transferred from SK to the new team. Now, there's some clarification of this in a minute, but you can see what he's saying there. Then New FNATIC. The majority of the lineup left, but with 2 core players stayed, and they added strong new players, including one who had been active in the active lineup before. The slot was reviewed, but stayed with FNATIC. So, okay, we'll go case by case here. So, I've already said the XLG SK one. The logic is the players left, all the players went to SK, there's only one slot, so they decided in favour of the players and SK, because Luminosity couldn't field a similar strength team, and just didn't have anyone as good, and didn't retain any of the players whatsoever, actually. So that prevents org abuse by Luminosity. Then you go to the XSK Team X one. Now, the logic on this one is that the players left SK, they did, because they were removed from SK. SK didn't want the slot, because remember, SK is getting the NA slot for their Brazilian team, and the players made a decent enough team of similar strength to Team X. I mean, that's debatable, but I'd say it's not that far off to transfer the slot to them, especially because there was no conflict with the org wanting it. So that's fine, I think, actually, there. And interestingly enough, Philip Rasmussen, who is PHE Demark on Twitter, who's in some way involved with Astralis, messaged the Flying DJ for some clarification, and he pointed out that only Freese and Modi are left from the original SK Gaming. Just saying. Flying DJ responds, yes, true. The key for this slot here was that none of the players stayed in SK, and SK did not want to field a lineup for it. Philip, still, by any measure, the slot should be up for grabs, no? It seems to me you're using a flexible clause to do as you please. Flying DJ, the logic is the same as it was for FNATIC. 2 players stayed, 3 adequate replacements came in for the ones that left. Philip, to be honest, I think it's a stretch to say that Wenton is a proper replacement for Flusher, but oh well, it's your league. So, I mean, you've seen Philip makes his own points there. It seems like they're changing the way they use the rules of the clause. I mean, actually, I can see what they mean in terms of like equivalent. So, for example, if we contrast the Team X situation with the Luminosity situation, Luminosity retained no players, so the slot was transferred to the guys who are now in SK. In the Team X situation, all the players left as well. SK doesn't even want the slot, therefore they transferred the slot here. It was reviewed, that's the whole point. So I don't think that that's terrible there. I agree, it's a little bit vague, like there's a room for interpretation, which is what the review process is, and people might want there to be a hard and fast rule on paper, but we'll get to later on why I don't think there can be, unfortunately. So the key one that everyone wants to talk about, obviously, is the FNATIC GODSENT one, because this is the one that's difficult. So remember, the original reasoning was the majority of the FNATIC lineup left, but 2 core players stayed, and they added strong new players, including one who had been in the active lineup before. The slot was reviewed, but stayed with FNATIC. So the logic is they kept enough players, and the org wants the slot, and the org is going to field a good enough team. Therefore, the slot stays with the org, who ultimately, that's the original way it works, is the org has the slot, unless there's extenuating circumstances, rather than GODSENT, even though GODSENT has more starters from FNATIC than FNATIC does. So, in terms of my own opinion on this one, I can actually see their logic again here. The problem is, if FNATIC had replaced their players with like shit players, and their team was much worse, and the GODSENT team was much better, obviously, then I could at least see a case for there being some debate here. But first of all, FNATIC didn't lose arguably their 2 best players at the moment, Olaf Meister and Dennis. They retained their 2 star players, as it were. They lost some players who've had their issues. JW certainly. Crims has been kind of up and down over the last few months. So it's not like they lost out terribly there. Twist and is a pretty solid replacement for any of those players. I think it's not a terrible one. Lecro's a player with potential. Admittedly, hasn't really lived up to the level of like a Flusher. And Wenton, okay, JW's better than him, I think, right now. Probably always will be. But that's only one player we're talking about. I think ultimately, if you look at it, FNATIC has a more skilled lineup than GODSENT. GODSENT has the history, but FNATIC has a good team. And FNATIC has a team which arguably you could even make the case the roster's as good or better than the last one. Well, no, let's not say that. As good or better than GODSENT. How about that? That's a better way to say it. So if you're deciding between the two, I can see some sort of logic where when the slot already belongs to the org, except for extenuating circumstances, I can see why in this instance they ruled in Fnatic's favour. Now, personally, I don't think Venton's very good. I don't think he's that skilled. But I think Twist is certainly fine. And Lecro, I mean, he's on the up. People like JW and Crims have been down the last few months. It's hard to necessarily... I'd say JW is like a wash there, and I think Crims is better, but it's not as definitive. It's not as obvious. There's no egregious abuse of power here. Now, I asked him for clarification on this matter, because again, what a lot of people are getting caught up with in, like Philip Rasmussen, is that they're thinking it's like a 3 out of 5 type rule. Therefore, it doesn't make sense as to why Team X gets a team with 2 out of 5. And so in the FNATIC GODSENT one, it seems egregious, right? Because if it's the 3 out of 5 rule, then it automatically should go to GODSENT. No discussion asked whatsoever. But remember, it's not a 3 out of 5 rule. It's not players who own the slot. It's the org who owns the slot unless certain conditions are met. And it has to go under review anyway. There's no set hard and fast rules necessarily. So I asked him, because the key problem I had was when he talked about bringing in keeping 2 starters and bringing a player who's on the active lineup in before, people might say, but technically, aren't 3 of the 5 starters of FNATIC still in FNATIC? Because Venton played in FNATIC at the EPL finals, right? First of all, that doesn't work because Venton, first of all, was explicitly a stand-in during that period of time. He was never a full member. Secondly, who was he replacing at EPL? Olofmeister. So even if you decided by that logic to transfer the starter position to Venton, that makes Olofmeister not a starter. You can only have 5 starters. That's the whole point. It's a starting 5. Therefore, in that scenario, FNATIC either has 2 out of the 5 starters by having Olofmeister or 2 out of the 5 starters by having Dennis and Wenton. So whichever you choose of the 2, they can only have 2 of the 5, and 3 of the 5 players who played at EPL finals and in the online portion are now in GODSENT. So 3 out of 5 would never work. So I asked him here for clarification here. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I said, a team can have 6 players on their roster and just keep 3 and the spot, even if 1 was expressly a stand-in, asking about Wenton. He replies, Schulze here, we would review the license every time the majority of the starting/standard playing lineup leaves the org, as he actually outlined in his tweet longer. In theory, there could, in cases where it's not clear, but the main goal is to protect the league from lineups which are not fitting the skill level of it. Ultimately, we want to make sure neither org nor the players have all the power over the slot. It should be adequately balanced. So I then spoke to him on Skype about this matter, and he said, I asked him about this like kind of ruling because I wanted to know. I mean, there's already been 3 seasons of ESL ESEA ProLeague, and there was an EPL season before that. I remember EPL Winter was one that Navi won over Titan in, I think it was like April or May, or it might be in April of 2015. So I asked him about like when did these rules change? Now he says the rules changed before season 3 began. And the key detail here, I'll read it in his words. We changed the slot rules a while ago because remember they combined EPL, which is what it now is, with ESEA, the North American one, and made ESEA the North American EPL. So he said, we changed the slot rules a while ago. ESEA had a 3/5 rule. ESL had a pure org owns the slot rule. But we didn't think either one was great. So we decided to put the slot for review once too many players leave. So let me have a look here. And then I asked him about the fact that, is it okay for this information to go public? And he says, yes, it's not in the player public rule book, but we inform the teams about license rules and remind them when they ask about player changes. And then I asked him, okay, just to test this whole thing of the fact that it's not a set number of players. So I asked him, would it work if only 1 player stayed and 4 other players came in who were amazing? So imagine Olofmeister was the only one in FNATIC who stayed, but you brought in 4 super sick players who were even better than the old FNATIC players. Would the spot still stay with FNATIC there and not the 4 departing members if they all stayed together as a unit? He says, tough call, especially if the 4 players had stayed together. I think we would lean towards FNATIC keeping it, which by the way is in line with what he said before. It's still all consistent actually logically. Would depend a bit on the circumstances. Did contracts run out, or did someone buy out the players? Which would not be something we want to encourage, buying out players to get slots. See, that's a problem, right? Not only is there player abuse, org abuse, but you could have another org who wants to get a slot, and they think, right, well, have we got enough to just buy like 3 of the players instead of the 2 we were going to, and then take their slot as well as those players? You can see where it's a tricky situation, and there isn't a hard and fast rule you can put on paper that is fair to everyone. If you make it the majority rule, then the players get all the power. If you make it just the org only with no review whatsoever, then the org has ultimate power over the players. In this scenario, there's going to be abuse on either sides. And that's something I want to talk about, because this notion that they want to avoid abuse by either groups, I mean, it's up to you whether you believe them or not, but I think actually their rules have been consistently applied. I actually think it's something that's quite noble and admirable. It needs to be done as well. It's very important, because I don't like either one. Everyone at the moment, because they're just fans of the players, goes, I want it to be players have all the power, as though that's something good. No, guess what? Players and workers can abuse their position if given all the power, just like employers and owners can abuse their position, and orgs. So player abuse, if players have all the power, the 3/5 rule, the ultimate example I give of this is actually one from WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, which is when there was a fighter in the 90s called the Ultimate Warrior. And he was getting to be incredibly popular with the fans. He was a very charismatic, very energetic guy with his crazy new style and really radical, extreme energy. And what he would do was, he'd built up his level to a high level where before like WrestleMania, I think it was, which was the big event of the year, he was going to be put over by Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan was at the time was the big face of the league, like the number one guy, who's the most popular. He was going to help Ultimate Warrior become the Ultimate guy, etc. I think this was exactly the one. And what happened is the Ultimate Warrior guy went to Vince McMahon, who was the guy who ran the WWF and owned it at the time, and said to him just before he was due to go out and fight the match, he said to this guy, if you don't give me $1 million right now, if you don't promise to pay me $1 million, I won't even go out. And everyone in the whole stadium is waiting for this guy to go out. So he, in that scenario, had all the power over Vince McMahon. He was like the player who has the power over the org. And in this scenario, Vince McMahon, to get him to go out, had to agree to it. And in fact, what Vince McMahon did is he agreed to it, let the Ultimate Warrior go out, fought the match, afterwards said, here's the money, you're fired, get out, and then never let that guy abuse him again in that way. Now, in that scenario, you can see how players could abuse it. So obviously, to give a player example, what if the guys from FNATIC had chosen to do this move one day before the next major begins? Because remember, FNATIC's qualified for the next major. But they don't just do it, just leave anyway, which they can do, by the way, in the 3/5 rule right now. But let's imagine a day before they leave, they go to FNATIC and they tell FNATIC, you know what, we've made you a lot of prize money, we've all won a lot of money, we've made a lot of money here, but you know what, we've got a great offer from this other org here. And our contracts, I mean, I guess in that scenario, that's the issue, isn't it? It's a contract issue. So you could say that covers this, but does it really? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, no one can really enforce a lot of these esports contracts and take years. So let's forget that part for a second, because you could technically just leave and no court would be able to do anything within a day to stop you playing. So let's imagine they go to FNATIC. This is just hypothetical, by the way. They've never done anything like this. They go to FNATIC and they say to them, right, unless you give us each $10,000, we're not going to play as FNATIC in this next major. We're going to play as GODSENT. And unless FNATIC does it, they go to GODSENT. And now FNATIC loses everything. FNATIC had put out all the stuff that they were going to play at this tournament. Everything was going to happen. And now they're screwed. That's player abuse. Now let's go the other way. That's when the players have all the power. Now let's look when the org has all the power. If the org owned the slot, and like the major slot or a slot in EPL, and they could put any team they wanted in, then obviously they could themselves just kick the whole team and get a new team anytime they wanted, including a more skilled team entirely. So in that scenario, what happens if EPL just was slot pure? There was no review process. Well, in that scenario, what could have happened is SK could have actually just kicked out all of the Danes, and they could have said, you know what, we're going to move the Brazilians to Europe. They're a way better team. That all fits, right? So we're just going to put our team in that slot there. Now, in this scenario, it would go under review, and in theory, if ESL is consistent with their rules, they'd say, no, this is abuse of the slot. Like, you haven't done it in a fair manner. You haven't even attempted to retain any of the original players. We review it since it's the majority issue. The players still want the slot. They're playing elsewhere with at least 2 or 3, so we'll give the slot to them. Now, that's if you believe that's the case, but that's what they're claiming at least right now. So another way org abuse could work would be the same thing. Now, this is much less likely, but in theory, imagine a day before the major, in a world where orgs owned all the slots, including major slots, FNATIC comes to the players and they tell the players, you know what, we actually could get better players than you right now. Like, actually, the SK players want to come and play for us at this major. But you know what? we're willing to stick with you guys. We just want you guys to take a salary cut and give up your salary for this month. So if you give up your salary, you can play in the major tomorrow because we own the slot. Otherwise, you're not playing in the major tomorrow. We're going to kick you out. We're just going to bring these other guys in. They're going to rep us. You can see how org abuse could happen there. I mean, to give a real-world example of org abuse, I don't know much about it, but I heard a story a while back, years back, of where one of the Call of Duty games was developed, and then afterwards, the Call of Duty game was selling and making fucking bajillion dollars on top of all the rest of it, and supposedly, whoever it was, the publisher or whoever owned Call of Duty, just fired the whole dev team and was like, you know what, fire all them, we're not going to give them raises, not going to give them any of the money, not going to give them bonuses, just bring in a new dev team and start working on a new game and pay them less money. And supposedly something like this happens. You can see how abuse can happen in that scenario. So my ideal, the only way to avoid all abuse is actually if you have the E-League type scenario, where what you say is you have to stay with an org for the whole season, and the org has to keep the majority team. Like, you can only bring in 2 different players at most. And in doing so, the org can't abuse you because they can't kick you all out. And the players can't abuse the org because they can't go and play somewhere else and remain in E-League. Now, I told you in my video about that, it was up there, E-League and SK, the only real way to make that work is that every team that even starts E-League should have to have it in their contracts that for the duration of that whole E-League season, they're in a situation where they're signed to that org for that period of time, therefore they won't be leaving anyways, no problem. Now, the issue for EPL is that can't be applied actually at all, because this isn't a scenario where the season's begun. This is a situation where it's between seasons, which is when actually player changes should happen. So you can't blame ESL for that. They're in a different situation to someone like E-League. Now, some issues that are happening here. First of all, the FNATIC issue, where if they kept one player and the other 4 left and wanted to play elsewhere, that could lead to org abuse. But supposedly, ESL would make the decision on that and decide whether it was org abuse. Now, again, it's up to you. Do you trust ESL? I can't say I trust them, but if they did it in the manner that was unreasonable and their conclusion was ridiculous, well, at least they've stated what their reasoning is and what the general criteria is and what they're going for, so at least we could critique them for it. At least they've actually laid out what they can there. Now then, the other way round, which we currently have, the major system, the 3/5 rule for the players owning the slot, is itself wide open to abuse from players. So I actually think, in a weird way, if you think logically, having leagues that aren't the majors be one way, which is orgs own the slot, and having the majors be players own the slot, actually means that the leagues that are non-Valve leagues, like EPL, ECS, can counteract, and E-League can actually counterbalance rather, the abuse that could happen from players with the majors. Because think about it, if players own the major slots, but orgs own all the other league slots, then you're in a world where it's more likely that players and orgs have to work together and come to a cooperation, otherwise someone's going to lose out. So yeah, the players could leave at any point in time and fuck their org over and just go and play as 3/5 as Billy Big Balls and his crew in the next major last second. But if they do so, then the org still retains the slot, and depending on the circumstances, if the players are abusing the scenario, and have left, for example, broken their contracts, then it could be the case that ESL can make it so that now the org gets to keep the slot in the other leagues and isn't punished in that sense. Now, the other way around, if the org tries to abuse the players and kicks them, sure, they keep their slot in the other league, depending on the circumstances, but now the players can just go and play for someone else at the major where the biggest money is and all the sticker money is and all the rest of it. So I actually think, in a weird way, if it works out, having the 2 different factions control slots in different aspects, but obviously, yeah, you need the majors of the most important events, but what are all the other events of the year? They're the other leagues. I think this actually provides a level of counterbalance where it's not just one force controlling the other. And I think that's actually not that bad. Now, the issue in terms of this deal is that particularly the Virtus Pro and the FNATIC issues are a problem, because from the outside, we know about that whole WISA thing. FNATIC are a WISA team. GODSENT aren't. So people are going to say, that's the reason you created these rules, that's the reason you ruled in this scenario. Now, ESL say that they had these rules already in place before in this review process. Virtus Pro are also a WISA team. And what people see as the reason why Virtus Pro got to play this wildcard match is they think that the league was expanded to 14 instead of 13 just to allow Virtus Pro to get back in the league. Now, I have to say, I agree with that last part, actually. I think that is why they expand the league. Now, by the way, I would like Virtus Pro to be in this league. I want to see Virtus Pro all offline events if I can. But with that said, I think with the old system, they probably shouldn't have expanded the league, if I'm being reasonable. Like, they probably should have kept the league as it was, 12 or 13, and Virtus Pro, by losing to Penta, should probably be playing in Premier right now. Doesn't matter that I want to see them on LAN. That's the way, according to a reasonable system, they probably should have done that. Now, it's up to ESL if they want to expand the league, but I think they did do that to bring Virtus Pro in. Now, did they rule in favour of FNATIC because they're a WISA team rather than GODSENT? I don't think so in that case, but I certainly think that Virtus Pro, not only being a fantastic team, but being a WISA team, had something to do with why a WISA team, which remember, is part of, it's not directly ESL, but it's ESL people running it, and in the future there's going to be broadcast rights involved there. I do think that WISA, in some way, whether it's just a coincidence, it's not a coincidence that VP are the team that they expanded to get back in the league, where they're one of the few WISA teams. Now, one of the interesting details about this is because it turns out EPL actually uses slot ownership, which is the same as E-League, we've actually now seen a level of hypocrisy among players and figures in this community. Because remember, the mass outrage among fans, pro players, and other orgs and personalities in the league over E-League, and saying like E-League abused their rules and had treated the Brazilians disgracefully. Some people even tried to like use like claims of like nationalism or racism and tried to say it was all a conspiracy of WISA and SK and Minsik Rice, the guy who's running the league as the commissioner. They put all these things in place in that particular sense. So we had Fallen and the Brazilian pros tweeting about it and tweeting publicly and about how this shouldn't be the case, and you know, players should own the sport and they earned the sport and played for the sport, therefore they deserve the sport. And Taz came out and he was like standing with them as well. Well, why aren't these people now tweeting about how GODSENT owned the spot in EPL, where, by the way, Fallen's the reigning champion? He would have the biggest voice, right? Why aren't Fallen and Taz? Taz has just got back into EPL, thanks to a tiny bit of fuckery on EPL and WISA's part. Where's Taz like, yeah, you know what? Actually, we didn't deserve this spot because we lost to Penta, and so we haven't played to earn our spot. And you know what? GODSENT should be in our spot instead, because they've actually the ones where they're 3/5 of the FNATIC ones. They should be in the league, or they should have the FNATIC slot. Where are all these people tweeting? Nothing. Silence. Now, these people, when they brought up this, also then tried to make it a bigger issue. Oh, they earned the slot, and you know what? There should be player rights, should be more important, not like greedy orgs, and there should be unions of players, and all this grand talk when it was about E-League. Fuck all about EPL, where these people are essentially like EPL, like ESL, and so even when the same things are happening, nothing to be said. Guess what? If you want to present yourself as a man of the people, someone who stands for what's right, and someone who stands for integrity, and is willing to speak out when you think something's done wrong, you got to be consistent, and even worse, this is what kills guys like you. You got to actually be willing to do it. When push comes to shove, you got to do it next time, and you got to do it next time. It's something that you've set forward so that you're this great person. Now you got to live up to that. And when you don't do that, even in saying nothing, that's conspicuous, and now we're going to call you hypocrites because this is hypocrisy. Now, the idea that teams have earned slots through their play is itself a very tricky situation, because first of all, what the fuck is earned? That's such a subjective term that you've decided the definition of. Sure, in terms of play, they were the team that played and were successful enough to get these org slots, like the FNATIC guys, for example. But that's ultimately irrelevant if it's an org-based league, just as it was in E-League. That is irrelevant. If the slot ownership goes to the org, there's no reason as to why it's about players playing in that scenario. And you don't see Fallen and those sort of guys and Taz boycotting EPL as well as E-League and saying, we're not playing any of these leagues. We'll only go and play in leagues where you earn your spot. Why aren't you doing that, guys? Oh, yeah, how convenient. You're not going to do that, are you? Now, let me ask you this. Would the orgs be in the league without good players? No, obviously not. But that's also why ESL themselves are trying to use a system where you can't just replace the whole team. You have to retain players. You have to field a reasonable squad. So they're acknowledging that the players have definitely played a part in the org managing to get there. Now, on the org side of things, the org has funded the team, has helped build the brand. Players were able to accomplish their own goals. So you know that whole the players earned their spot. Yeah, the players couldn't have earned their spot without also the help of the org, the financial backing, the support, being put in position, having managers provided for them who get paid, analysts, obviously all the flights and all the rest of it. The org does their own part as well. With that said, players were paid for their efforts. Like, players played, and at the end of their contracts, now owe the org nothing. They were paid up to that point. It was work for hire, and now the players can go elsewhere. It's not an investment in that sense. I don't like it when anyone phrases it that way. As soon as the contract ends, there is no investment. You're not paying something for the future. That's why when the contract ends, you don't owe the player any more money. He owes you nothing more as well. It's an even affair in that sense. Now, it's certainly not the players' fault, by the way, that FNATIC, in the major scenario, is now actually, because of the 3/5 rule, FNATIC is now, sure, FNATIC's won out in EPL, but in the major system, FNATIC's lost out massively. FNATIC now has to go to the minor, win the minor or place top 2, then get to the qualifier, then get through the qualifier. So that's terrible for FNATIC, right? After all that they've put into the team. But you know what? It's not the players' fault that FNATIC has to do it. It's not GODSENT's fault that FNATIC has to do it. That's Valve's fault. Valve created that system. If Valve used a Dota international type scenario, they could have it where FNATIC just plays the next tournaments, and if by the next major, FNATIC's won enough or placed highly enough, FNATIC gets a direct invite, like you do to the international if you place highly enough at tournaments. And that would be a way to avoid that whole system and to still have players be able to do it without the whole worrying about the slot thing, because they don't have a slot thing, and they actually use a roster lock of 5 players for the international and majors, etc. So Valve have their own system, and I don't think the Dota 2 system's ideal either. It just has its own way of doing it. I actually think that one thing you have to acknowledge is that actually esports is better than pro sports in this particular respect, especially in the balance of power between the two. In real sports, traditional sports, all the power lies with the team. They own the slot. That is their slot. It's their team. End of story. They retain the slot no matter what. They could kick everyone. Then again, there's also no scenario in any pro sport I'm aware of where a majority of the team could leave, would go to someone else who doesn't have a slot, and then somehow demand they would. That would never happen anyway, so I guess that circumstance will never be tested, but they would definitely lose in that scenario. It would definitely be the owners of the slot initially. Also, the players do get compensated in real sports with enormous salaries compared to a normal person's job of any kind. That means that they are essentially, that's what they're getting. They're getting massive salaries and they don't own anything. They have no equity in any of the spots or the orgs. Now, true, the reason they have enormous salaries is because of player unions and the power and pressure that they can exert, which in the future esports will be able to have. But there's no perfect solution. There's no perfect balance here. You can't go one or the other. You can't have orgs own slots in every type of league. You can't have players own slots in every type of league. It will just lead to rampant abuse, and both parties will get fucked for their long-term futures and what they've done for those brands or those players, depending on who you're talking about. This approach is actually as close to an ideal as approach as I think you can get right now. There is no hard and fast rule you can set that won't be exploited in some way. This is trying to look at the spirit of the rule and see if you've adhered to the spirit of it. It is the case that obviously it's open to abuse by ESL because they're the ones who make the review, but until you actually can find me an example of where you show they've done that and have been inconsistent, which they haven't in these 4 cases, I actually think that's unreasonable to suggest they were corrupt when there's no reason to at the moment. Now, we've got to watch in the future and make sure they're consistent with it and make sure that this is reasonably done. Now, the reason why I think this is as close to an ideal as possible is because at the moment, orgs can't just put in a shit team and keep the slot no matter what. Players can't just wreck an org last second and leave them high and dry, completely dead in the water. I think ultimately this is quite a reasonable approach. There's certainly some flaws in it. There's no ideal situation. And at the moment, I at least have to think about it. Can't think of a much better system. And I actually think if you look on the holistic entire scene, having non-Valve leagues be org owns the slot and having the majors be player on the slot actually is a counterbalancing, countervailing force to each other. And I think should mean more cooperation between the players and the orgs than if all was owned by the orgs or all was owned by the players. And I think that's actually quite reasonable. And when you look at the criteria, it's actually been a bit overblown that ESL have been corrupt here.